Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
The path to productivity runs right through calm. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome back productivity guru Chris Bailey. Chris was on the show way back in October 2020 on episode 29, Focus and Get Things Done with Chris Bailey. He's been dubbed by TED as the most productive man you could hope to meet. His journey as a productivity expert has in recent years led him to dive deeply into the world of being a little calmer. And as he puts it, the pursuit of calm ultimately leads us to become more engaged, focused, and deliberate, whilst making us more productive and satisfied with our lives. In an anxious world, investing in calm is the best productivity strategy around. So says his new book, How to Calm Your Mind, Finding Peace and Productivity in Anxious Times. And when I read that, I knew I had to have him back on the show to find out more. So I was thrilled that he agreed to come back and share a little more of his perspective on the relationship between calm and productivity. I think you'll really enjoy our conversation today. We touch on all kinds of things, from dealing with anxiety and burnout, through to managing your relationship with distractions and overstimulation, and how you might reset it and find not just calm for the sake of better mental health and satisfaction, but also because it makes you more productive and allows you to get more done. I started our conversation by asking Chris to read a short extract from the start of his new book. So we'll hear that from Chris now and then get right into the conversation. So without further ado, here's Chris reading from How to Calm Your Mind.
During this journey to calm, my productivity levels rose dramatically as I became less anxious and burnt out. With a clear, calm mind, I could write and connect ideas with relative ease. When I would typically have written several hundred words, I found myself penning a couple thousand. With less anxiety, I became more patient. I listened more deeply and became far more engaged with whomever I was with and in whatever I was doing. My thoughts were crisp, my ideas sharp, my actions more deliberate. I became more intentional and less reactive. My mind no longer frazzled by outside events. And I connected with the purpose behind my actions, which made my days feel more meaningful.
Well, look, Chris, thank you so much for sharing that little extract. And welcome back to the Exam Study Expert Podcast.
It is nice to chat with you again. How have you been?
Really good, thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Good.
Look, I mean, thank you for sharing that little extract. I mean, that just spoke to me so deeply, and I think would speak to a lot of our listeners as well, just because something I've long preached on the podcast is the goal of studying smarter, not harder. I think it's in the strapline of the podcast itself. And it's really interesting. When most people hear that, they hear that direction of causality. So they hear, okay, I'm going to learn how to study smarter, be more effective, and therefore I don't need to study as hard. I don't need to put in as many hours. But actually, I've always said that the direction of causality goes the other way as well. So by not studying quite so hard, you give yourself the energy and intensity that you need in order to use the most effective study strategies. Yeah. Or to kind of give the counterexample, like if you study too hard, if you overstudy and exhaust yourself and burn out effectively, then you run out of the energy and the concentration you need in order to use the most effective study strategies. And so you don't study as smart. And I feel like we're probably on a fairly similar page in that respect in terms of your thoughts about the interplay between calm and productivity.
Yeah, that is such a good parallel with where I was heading with this book. It's kind of like when an actor aces an audition because they don't care about acing it. It's kind of a similar effect where we tend to sometimes focus on the wrong things when it comes to productivity. And, there's a lot of good productivity advice out there. I've spent the better part of the last decade trying to filter out the stuff that works from the stuff that doesn't in my previous work. And I actually think we need the traditional productivity advice more than ever, especially given all that has changed in the last 2 or 3 years since we've chatted last. But it's so critical at the same time that we develop our capacity for productivity in the first place. And that's where calm comes in. And it seems like such an odd thing to focus on as it relates to personal achievement. But I think it's more critical than ever, especially when we live in such an anxious time, in such an anxious world. I noticed the effects of this myself going through a period of anxiety and burnout in my own life, and realizing just how devastating the effects of that were, not only for my mental health, but also for my work. I wasn't able to accomplish nearly as much as I was before, of course, in that burnt out and anxious state. I think we all have a lot of examples from our own experiences for just how much anxiety can hamper our productivity. If you're about to give a speech in front of 1,000 people and you have to go on stage in 15 minutes, and I asked you to, I don't know, read a book or read a research paper or write something, you probably wouldn't be able to direct a lot of attention towards that task. Yeah. And that's the effect of anxiety. Anxiety shrinks our cognitive capacity and our ability to get work done. It shrinks our attentional space, an idea I think we chatted about last time, our working memory capacity, by about 20%. It makes us more distractible. It leads to more negative self-talk. It leads us to be less engaged and less present in what we're doing. And it seems to limit our cognitive performance in general. And so we're not always in a state where we're about to go on stage in 15 minutes for 1,000 people. But anxiety is that same effect, only smaller, but all day long, where we don't realize that our capacity for getting things done has been diminished, and not to mention our capacity for enjoying ourselves and appreciating what we're doing and connecting with what we're doing, which also is motivating in and of itself, as you're saying in the example that you're giving. And so it's this fascinating idea where sometimes, when we care about productivity too much, we can sometimes work too hard, which has a negative effect on our productivity. And ironically, very ironically, by stepping back and investing in strategies like that intentionality, like that thoughtfulness, and like building a capacity for calm and presence, we can get that much further over the longer arc of time.
Absolutely. And this is a conversation I often find myself having in some form with either coaching clients or with podcast listeners, or students that come to our workshops or whatever. They're in a state where they're incredibly ambitious, and maybe we'll touch on ambition in a little bit. But they're incredibly ambitious, so they think they need to work very, very hard. Burn the midnight oil. These kind of crazy schedules I've seen sometimes where you might be leaving yourself 5 hours. I literally saw one schedule, and this was a high school kid, so he was 17, 18, and he'd got his Google Calendar scheduled out with activities planned up until midnight each night, right, and then from 5 a.m. in the morning. He said he had problems focusing and concentrating on his work. Yeah. And, I mean, to you, that probably sounds obvious. Well, of course you're having problems concentrating on your work if you're, sleeping 5 hours a night. Yeah. It's a really tough situation to be in. I guess my question would be, like, if you're in that kind of situation where, you're kind of trapped in this cycle of, gosh, I've got to do this work. I've got to do all this work. I've got these ambitions. I need to get this grade. I need to get this pass. And you starting to feel exhausted or even burnt out, like, how do you even start to kind of break the cycle and kind of step out of that situation? Like, where do we begin?
Yeah, it's so interesting, because I found that in my own journey away from anxiety, that there was a lot of anxiety embedded within that ambition.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned the self-talk that we have. That self-talk is often That's often a symptom of anxiety, right? The racing and uncontrollable thoughts that we have. I remember looking back when I was super, super driven by the ambition, and I still do have ambition. It's just less generalized and more directed at specific goals that will make a tangible difference. And I think that's kind of the key to understand is ambition can be good or bad. It depends whether it is thoughtful ambition, right? What are we aiming at? Are we aiming at the generalized pursuit of more, which the research, when you look at it, shows the generalized pursuit of more actually makes us miserable because it leads us to become less present with what we're doing, which makes us enjoy our life less, and also ironically makes us less productive because presence is the process through which we actually become productive. So it's another one of those counterintuitive loops. But it's fascinating often how much anxiety is embedded within that construct of ambition simply because that ambition is generalized and we always feel as though we have to be making progress because we've adopted the default goals that often the world around us gives us, which is the pursuit of more regardless of the context. And it's often kind of ironic how the pursuit of more manifests in our life. Like we want more takeout food at lunch, but we also want more fitness. We want more money for retirement, but we also want more material possessions in the moment. We have this generalized pursuit of more often. I think the key there is to weed out the anxiety, the racing, the uncontrollable thoughts. In my own experiences, some of my symptoms were feeling restless and on edge, having difficulty concentrating. So that's actually another symptom of anxiety, which is often something that we just try to force ourselves out of instead of taking a step back and dealing with the underlying root problems there. Having trouble sleeping is also another symptom of anxiety that you were mentioning. A rapid heartbeat, palpitations, nausea, an upset stomach, dizziness, and lightheadedness. That was one I experienced a lot too. Or as well as this feeling of kind of impending doom or fear was another thing that came up for me. And so I think the answer is kind of twofold to the question is how much anxiety is embedded within your ambition? And in that ambition, how much of that ambition is actually targeted at specific goals that will make a tangible difference? And how much has your ambition become generalized, which will actually serve to make you less productive over the longer arc of time? So ambition is this fascinating, it's something I explore in the book in great depth, as you know, but it's, and I promise that's my one and only plug for the book during the interview.
You're allowed one, Chris. Yeah. It's a very strict rule.
There it is. Yeah. It's fascinating that the research on ambition is quite mixed in this regard as to how helpful ambition even is.
I find this a really interesting idea because so many of our listeners are pretty ambitious people. I was still am a pretty ambitious person. For goodness sake, we are a podcast about how to study for your exams. You tend not to tune into a podcast about how to study unless you are a pretty ambitious kind of person.
Yeah.
So I guess the question that kind of came to mind for me around all this is, well, the ambition is probably quite specific. It is probably quite goal oriented in a lot of the cases for our listeners. So it's ambition around a particular set of grades or getting into a particular college or getting what you need from a college to get to a particular career. It would tend to be quite specific, I think, for a lot of our listeners. Yeah. But would the ambition then, would you then consider that ambition to be problematic? And if so, what would your kind of counsel or advice be for, I guess, an ambitious student specifically?
I think, when you are ambitious towards a goal, that's a positive thing, especially when the goals that we set are connected with what we value. I think values are the key here, where we feel as though our behavior is meaningful when we can observe ourselves manifesting our values through our actions. And so values is something that I love to explore. It's something I love to write about. Yeah. And there's a theory of values from Shalom Schwartz, where he essentially, it's the most commonly accepted construct of values in the research. And he essentially boils the literature down to 10 basic fundamental human values. And those are self-direction. So that's independent thought and action. That's number one. Number two is stimulation. So that's excitement, novelty, challenge. Number three is hedonism. So it's pleasure, it's gratification for ourselves. Achievement is actually another fundamental human value. So, demonstrating competence according to societal standards. Power is another one. So that's social status and prestige, also control over sometimes people and resources. It's not as common of a value, but it is a basic value that many of us have. Security is another one. That's, safety, it's stability. Conformity is number 7. So that's making sure that our impulses aren't going to upset or harm other people. Tradition is another value. So that's respect, it's commitment, it's acceptance of customs. Benevolence is number 9. So that's preserving and enhancing the welfare of people. And universalism, one value that I have quite a bit of, it's understanding, appreciation, tolerance, and protection for the welfare of people and of nature. And we all have a different level on each of these values. So let's say for simplicity's sake, we're 2 on some out of 10 and a 4 out of 10 on others and a 9 out of 10 on others. I think ambition becomes most meaningful when it is aligned to what we truly value. So if you do value achievement, and that's totally fine because that is a fundamental human value. If you do value that personal success and you're able to manifest success in your own life through grades, through those traditional measures of success, then you're going to find that your actions are quite meaningful. But if you don't necessarily value achievement and you find that that is kind of an expectation that other people have of you, but you find that you value, say, tradition and self-direction and creativity, which would be a part of that, and you can observe yourself manifesting those things, then you're going to feel more meaningful under those circumstances. And so I think, like all good things in this space, it really does come down to who we are as human beings and accommodating for our unique situations, our unique personalities, and just who we are on a fundamental human level. And what lies at the core of who we are those basic human values. And so achievement is one of those fundamental human values in a very curious way. But I think we need to accommodate the fact that achievement can be addictive, where the pursuit of more, the more we achieve, the more we want to achieve, because once we get a little taste of more, we want even more of whatever currency we're trying to optimize for in our life, whether that currency be grades or financial success or social recognition or status or fame or the contribution we're trying to make or how happy we are. And so I think this is a trap that I fell into in my own work, where I value achievement. I still do value achievement. It's how I'm able to contribute to the world and to other people. But at the same time, in over investing in that one value of achievement, I forgot about self-direction, having this independent thought and action a lot of the time, kind of doing work that was defined for me by consulting clients, things like that. I forgot about nature. I forgot about people. I forgot about the traditions that I hold so dear. I forgot about so many different other elements of my life. And so I think ambition is something that is worth reflecting on, especially as it connects with what we value. And so when our ambition allows us to act more in accordance with what we value and manifest these values through our actions, then it becomes far more meaningful. But we don't necessarily feel connected with who we are. And ambition can be blind and far less meaningful when we're simply just adopting this value of ambition that the culture around us seems to have that maybe we don't necessarily do.
I think that's a really smart way of looking at it. Ambition is absolutely fine if it's aligned with your values, but and a very healthy thing if it's aligned with your values. But if it's not congruent with who you are and what's important to you, if it's sort of should we say someone else, possibly someone else's ambition? It might be your parents' ambition for you that you go on to be, I don't know, an investment banker, but maybe you've got an incredible, maybe you're 10 out of 10 on universalism, and you'd be much more congruent and feel much more aligned if you were, going and doing something in the third sector, or working for a sort of charitable organization or something.
Yeah. And this is the fascinating thing. I found that it wasn't until this kind of the last few years in my life that I've started to really reflect on my own values and what I truly care about as an individual human being. And that's a whole other conversation, because individualism versus collectivism is a value across different cultures. But setting that aside for the time being, it's fascinating how we naturally tend to adopt the values of the world around us. So the world around us values more, so we try to accumulate more financial resources and possessions. At least I fell into this trap myself. The world around us values, currencies of success, like follower counts, for an example. So that's something that we try to optimize for. But in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, as with all advice on any podcast ever, take what works for you and leave the rest.
Sure.
But I found that when I really thought about it, I didn't care about a lot of these default values that surrounded me in our modern culture. I did care about some of them. Happiness is something I care about. Calm is something I care about, something I care about more and more. Achievement is something I care about. Contributing to others is something I care about. But I think the last place we should be looking for, especially happiness advice from, is the modern world. The modern world is not happy. Look around. Anxiety is the same way. When we adopt these default priorities, look around. A lot of people are anxious right now, and it's no surprise why when you begin to deconstruct the trappings of the modern world that we find ourselves in. But it's so worth reflecting on the defaults that we adopt when we don't take that step back, and really trying to make the connection between our daily behavior and those fundamental human values that we hold. Because the more aligned that is, the more we will feel true to who we are. And also the more meaningful and productive our actions will become. We'll see that our behavior is aligned to who we are on a personal, fundamental human level. And we'll find more motivation, we'll find more drive, and we'll naturally become more productive and accomplished if that is something that you care about, as well as less burnt out. We'll become more engaged as well there too.
Yeah. So I want to put you on the spot a little bit, if you're up for it, Chris. And in pursuit of, should we say, a calmer campus, whether it's a sort of university or college or a school, high school, if you were parachuted in as dean and you had total power to change whatever you wanted on campus, you can change things like timetabling, assessments, interventions if you want. You can do something differently with the physical environment, or just give the students in your institution some specific guidance or advice. I just wondered if there's anything that came to mind in terms of how you might set up the conditions for more calm in a kind of educational setting.
One interesting aspect of modern anxiety is the connection with technology. And so we tend to all fly at a pretty high level of mental stimulation because we're always stimulating our mind through the use of technology, especially around dopamine is something that comes up a lot as a chemical of stimulation. And so I would look at where super stimuli are on the average high school or college campus. Super stimuli are this fascinating idea. So anything that is a super stimuli is basically a highly processed, exaggerated version of something that we're biologically programmed to crave and enjoy. So, food is a good example of this. A lot of modern food, if you hop on Uber Eats or or whatever your delivery app of choice is. It's very salty, it's sugary, it's fatty, it's highly processed. And we evolved to crave things that are salty, sugary, and fatty. And so we tend to overeat with those kinds of things. But social media is a super stimuli because it's a highly processed, exaggerated version of social interaction. It kind of mimics social reaction in a way where it's time with our friends. Our ancient mind sees it as that. But in reality, we're really just trading these dopamine hits with one another over the internet. Online news is a really good example as well. It's incredibly novel. It's incredibly exaggerated. By default, we care about other people and we want to know what's happening and we want to stay abreast of all the things that directly, all the potential threats that directly affect our life. And so, of course, we tend to the news quite often and refresh that throughout the day too. And we tend to these super stimuli quite often throughout the day because we find them so difficult to resist in the moment. So if I were making a change to a high school or a college, and maybe this is more wishful thinking than anything, because if I think about how this could be implemented, I think it might be a bit too constrained and people should have, more freedom and control over what they do throughout the day. But finding ways of cutting back and eliminating these super stimuli whenever we possibly can, I think is critical, as well as, in its place, instead of spending more time in the digital world. I think one great thing about environments like a campus is they're the analog world. Why would you want to go to a campus to look at a screen when we can interact with others, we can get to know each other, we can form these interpersonal connections which I think we're missing out on a lot. And hardly anything calms us more than time with other people. But loneliness is through the roof right now. And people have far fewer friends and more looser connections. So anything to foster connection and opportunities to look into the eyes of each other instead of just looking at a screen and tending to these super stimuli, I think would be helpful.
I'm really glad you brought up that the issue about technology and screens and the whole world of super stimuli as you coin it, because it's a huge issue for so many of the students I talk to, and it's something their parents worry about a lot. It's probably the most commonly asked question I get from parents. How can I help my son or daughter get off their screen or be less distracted by their laptop or their phone or whatever device they're using?
But by the way, I have heard so many parents ask that question, after talks, after things like that. And then, I'll run into them in the hall or something. Then they're on their phone. Yeah. And I think, why are you trying to get your kid to live by a different standard than you are? If you're having such a challenge, maybe they are too. Maybe it's not something you can just control in their life. Maybe it's something you have to work on too.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And actually, my wife is leading the charge in our household. So we have a 15-month-old daughter at home, and even before she was born, she was already. My wife, was already conscious. Not our daughter. My wife was already conscious of the need, and I was completely behind her on this. That as parents, we want to set good examples for use of technology around the home, and so we try to avoid using our phones in the bedroom. We try to leave them in the hallway in a little box wherever possible, all that kind of thing. And we don't always live up to the standards we aim for, but we do our best, and I hope we improve over time. That's often the first thing I say as well. I guess as a parent of a teenager, you might sometimes feel a little bit powerless to set a good example, and you think, well, they're not going to follow what I do, and they might not follow what you do immediately, but actually, I think over the long run, the modeling can often have a really big impact.
Incredibly. The modeling, the research on modeling is actually fascinating, and it makes far bigger difference than we think it. If a manager, for example, at a company sends email over the weekend, their employees become far, far more likely to send email over the weekend. using phones during meetings is very similar at a company. And in a home environment, we look at other people for how we should behave and kind of the customs and norms of a household. So, yeah, I think modeling is the key there.
Yeah. It's really interesting that was kind of this was the first thing that came to mind when you were thinking about, what we might do differently on campus level, because, as we said back at the start, a lot's changed over the last few years. And I think one of the things that's really changed in education is that the pandemic has really pushed the transition to online, to digital, to screen-based. So, a lot of schools will, and colleges, universities as well, will be kind of primarily now run by, platforms like Microsoft Teams or Google Classroom, and that's where assignments are set and completed and marked, and it all just lives digitally. Textbooks are more often digital. Exams are more often digital. The Venn diagram that you talk about is coming to mind at the moment. So you kind of have this nice way of talking about, well, okay, there's this Venn diagram, and there are some activities that can only be done digitally. Social media, there are some activities that can only be done in the analog world, like walking or cooking. And then there are maybe some activities in the middle, in the overlap of those Venn diagram circles, that could be either analog or digital, depending on your choice. And I think as an individual in education, so an individual student, you do have a choice for some of those activities in the middle of the Venn diagram. So, examples coming to mind for me are things like flashcards, for example. You can choose to make flashcards, great way to do learning, great way to do memorization. You can choose to make them through digital tools like Quizlet or Anki, or you can choose to do them analog and do them on paper. And, students I talk to sometimes go one way, sometimes go the other. But I think perhaps this whole thing about super stimuli and kind of avoiding taking opportunities to take yourself out of the digital world could be a good argument for, in cases like this, for example, the flashcards, opting to go the analog route.
Yeah, exactly. And there is fascinating research behind why the analog world is so beneficial to cultivating our attention, as well as a sense of calm and a less anxious mind and a more productive mind. And it's because there are essentially two brain networks in our brain that are reverse correlated with one another. So when one is activated, the other isn't. And not to nerd out too much, but one...
No, we love nerding out. Go on.
Okay. All right. Let's nerd out then a little bit. So there's one brain network that supports us in being present with something, anybody that we're with, anything that we're doing. So we have a presence network, and we also have the dopamine driven networks, especially those that support us in, we already chatted about kind of the first one, this pursuit of more. So as we're pursuing more, we actually become less present and focused. And that's why neurologically. But stimulation is one that we just touched on as well. And so when we tend to something that is a super stimuli, this fires up these stimulation networks in our brain. And this reduces activity in the networks in our brain that lead us to become present with whatever it is we're doing and whomever it is that we're with. So this is why super stimuli, over time, they kind of train our brain to become a bit less focused and present with whatever it is that we're trying to do, because that network just isn't activated in our brain. And often it's not used to being activated. There aren't kind of effective traces in our brain that correspond with that network. But this is why that analog and digital divide is so interesting to think about, because our brain relates to these two different environments completely differently. So if the digital world is about stimulation, it's often built around stimulation, it's built around efficiency. The analog world is built around that presence, that slowness, that meaning, that depth, and that just richness with whatever it is that we're doing. And so it also activates that present network in our brain too. The analog world is where other people are. It's where nature is. It's where all the things that calm our mind tend to be. And so one general heuristic that I love to use for my own life, and I'd say I follow this probably about 90% of the time. There are some exceptions to this rule, as there are with any kind of rule out there. The heuristic that I like to use is when I want to do something efficiently, I'll do it in the digital world. And when I want an experience to have meaning, I'll do it in the analog world, because that's where depth is, that's where engagement is, that's where presence is. And I find this to be a generally good rule. And often, it doesn't apply in all cases, because sometimes in the analog world, what we lose in efficiency, we more than make up for in how deliberately we're able to act. And so, take for a simple example, keeping our to-do list in the analog world, or flashcards in the analog world is another good example of this. Yeah. We maybe can't do things as fast as we can digitally when we write out flashcards or print them off or write out our to-do list, but we have extra thoughtfulness that we dedicate towards these activities. We might think a bit more about why we got an answer wrong if it's a physical flashcard instead of just going on to the next one. For a to-do list, we can't necessarily tab over to Twitter or Instagram. We're stuck on that sheet of paper that has our to-dos on it. And so when meaning matters, go analog. And when efficiency matters, the digital world can add a lot of efficiency to our life. My wife is a professor of economics, and if she tried to run a regression on paper, I'm pretty sure it would take her just a little bit longer than doing it digitally in R or something. Yeah. But whatever it is that you can pull into this analog world, because you mentioned the Venn diagram, you can kind of picture two circles that overlap in the middle, one circle for analog only things, one circle for digital only things. And where they meet in the middle, those are the opportunities to introduce more calm into our life and more meaning and more richness without necessarily losing all that much. I think we actually gain more than we lose when we bring things into the analog world. So it could be a to-do list, could be time with friends, spending that time in person instead of trading dopamine hits online. It could be picking up a physical book and cracking it open and making notes in the margin. It could be playing games. It could be just looking up words even. It could be consuming the news the analog way too. So there are countless examples of activities that live in the middle that we can welcome into our analog world. On average, we spend over 13 hours a day looking at screens. And so any opportunity to reduce that amount of time, I think we should take.
Absolutely. I tell you what, Chris, I'm a little bit obsessed with how to learn efficiently, as you might know, and I'm sure our listeners know. Yeah. I'm now itching to go away and do the study of Quizlet versus paper flashcards and see which group learns the most and retains the most on the test.
I would be super curious because you do have these kind of double loops of reflection around what you're doing. So, but writing down the things on the flashcards is, another loop around the learning process. And then refreshing your mind when you see them and the physicality and the presence that it leads to. Simply, one underrated thing about the analog world too is not really having the immediate option to do something else. If you're sitting down on a table with a bunch of flashcards and your phone is on the other side of the house, for example, you're going to be focused on that activity, and it's going to take a bit of effort to get up and distract yourself versus the digital way very quickly.
Okay, so one final thing I'd love to just touch on briefly is, so many of us are sort of used to this level of stimulation in our lives from these various stimuli. Maybe it's social media for you, maybe it's gaming, maybe it's, for me, as I think it is for you, you mentioned, checking your performance metrics. I'm the same. I log in every day and I check my blog stats and my podcast downloads. And how do we break the cycle? How do we reset our tolerance or our appetite for that kind of stimulation?
Yeah. So I played around with a lot for resetting this stimulation tolerance. And somewhat, it was interesting where the most effective solution that I found for destimulating our mind, stimulation is a problem because the more stimulated our mind becomes, the more stimulation we crave by default because we want to stay at that same level of stimulation. So, this is why when you wake up with your phone and you go to Instagram first thing, and then you go to Twitter, and then, over to a different app, and then play a game for a little bit, you want to keep getting those super stimuli hits throughout the day simply because they release dopamine, and dopamine is addictive. It's addictive on a chemical level. And dopamine fasting is a term that's been thrown around quite a bit. And it's kind of a misnomer, though, because we can't fast from dopamine. We need dopamine to think logically. We need dopamine to think creatively. Our body relies on dopamine for its basic biological functions. But as we were kind of talking about over the course of the interview, it does have a bit of a darker side as it relates to accomplishment, where we crave more accomplishment. The more accomplished we becomes kind of a negative cycle if we don't channel that ambition thoughtfully and deliberately. But we also get that dopamine release when we tend to something that's stimulating. And so stimulation becomes addictive. And so we find ourselves becoming very distractible. We find it difficult to focus. And the best way that I found of taming this impulse for distraction is a stimulation fast. So we can't really fast from dopamine any more than we can fast from carbohydrates on a chemical level. But what we can fast from are the empty sources of dopamine, the shallower sources of dopamine, where we engage with an activity primarily for the hit of dopamine itself, whether that be a video game, whether that be the social media, whether that be any super stimuli that tends to find its way into our life. And so a stimulation fast is quite, I find that a period of about a month works really well for me. But essentially, you identify the things that you want to weed out. Anything that you engage with because it's really novel, it's super stimulating. Identify things to weed out in a list, perhaps, and then identify some well-rounded things, maybe things in the analog world that you want to introduce in its stead. So maybe a musical instrument you haven't picked up in a while. Maybe it's a physical books. Maybe it's volunteering and getting those hours. Maybe it's any project in the analog world, really. Anything that makes you feel proud or connected or a rush, like with exercise and working out. And so make a list of those as well, because when you find yourself wanting to distract yourself, you can engage with one of these activities during the fast. And just notice what changes over the course of this month or so. Because in my opinion, the best habits as it relates to calm and productivity and anxiety and burnout are self-reinforcing, where we notice them working. And so we want to continue engaging with and investing in them. And so stimulation fast is such a great way of weeding out these dopaminergic activities and distractions that have kind of started to grow in the little cracks that comprise our day like weeds. We can really tame them through a stimulation fast. And I find myself conducting a stimulation fast maybe every 3 to 4 months or so for about a month, because I find that the focus that I have afterward and the lack of anxiety that I have afterward and the calm that I have afterward that leads me to deliberately, thoughtfully become more productive is just such an incredible dividend and worth the effort and the struggle many, many times over. But substitute activities really does work wonders for this activity, as well as identifying the things that you want to weed out for a month.
Not just subtracting, but substituting, not just taking away,
exactly,
but finding what to add back. Fascinating. Chris, thank you so much for the conversation today. You've been incredibly generous with your time and your wisdom, as always. I wondered if we could maybe just conclude with perhaps your favorite little pearl of wisdom that might be relevant to people listening today. And then I'd love to hear, where can people find more about Calm and the world of Chris Bailey generally?
Thank you so much for having me on again. We'll have to make sure that we don't go several years without chatting next time.
Let's not leave it so long next time.
Yeah, well, Yeah, exactly. Maybe the world will fare a bit better if we don't go so long without chatting. One little idea that I think is worth sharing is that calm is not very interesting. And calm is not something that I ever really sought until I found a complete absence of it in my own life. I was on stage giving a talk in front of about 100 people when I had a panic attack. And it was a really, garbage feeling on stage. Luckily, I made through the talk on autopilot mode. And afterward, I really asked myself the question, like, what do I have to do? What has to be true in my life to welcome more calm into my days? And that's what motivated me to look at this research and really find and discover how powerful that calm can be. It may not be something that we seek by default. And at the same time, though, I have, over this past decade or so of writing about productivity full-time and researching productivity full-time, it is one of the most powerful tools that we can possibly have at our disposal for doing good work and living a good life and developing our capacity for presence, for being engaged with whatever it is that we're doing and whomever it is that we're with. I think it's the most underrated ingredient for productivity during a time as anxious as the one that we're in right now. I think actually in an anxious time, the path to productivity runs straight through calm for all the reasons that we talked about. Calm leads us away from burnout. It leads us away from anxiety. It improves our cognitive performance. It makes us less reactive. It makes us more focused, creative, and of course, productive. And so I would really encourage people to consider the things that may be affecting their productivity that they don't necessarily realize. And I think calm would be at the very top of that list.
Fantastic. Well, that's wonderful advice. And I think you put it so well. Chris, I'm sure many listening will be eager to dive deeper into the world of calm and productivity. Tell us where we can go for more.
Oh, yes. The book is called How to Calm Your Mind. And in my opinion, it is the best thing that I have ever written. And it is wherever books are sold. And I'd encourage you to pick it up. And my website is chrisbailey.com. And my podcast is called Time and Attention. I do it with my wife. We chat about productivity, and she sometimes talks about economics.
Amazing. Well, look, Chris, we'll link all three of those in the show notes and highly recommend people check them out. I was actually chatting to someone earlier today who said they listened to our first conversation and now they are an avid listener of the podcast and
I love it.
Looking forward to getting your new book, etc. So
awesome.
Yeah, no, it obviously really resonates with a lot of people, and I highly rate your content and what you have to say about the subject, and I don't say that lightly. So thank you so much for coming on again and sharing perspective on calm and productivity. It's always great to chat, and wishing you all the best. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Wasn't that wonderful? If you're feeling inspired, why not leave us a rating and a review in your podcast app? It would make our day. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.